Well, it looks like the U.S. Senate is looking to stand up to the president with respect to his ongoing disgusting incestuous relationship with the Saudi royal family. The president decided to recently approve an arms deal with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates worth about $8.1 billion, which would allow the two Arab monarchy states to purchase arms from U.S. defense contractors who are essentially de facto government agencies. Now, Congress is supposed to have the power to review any and all arms export sales to every country, and therefore it is illegal for the White House to go around and make these deals and approve them all on their own. This requires congressional approval. And it looks like Congress is actually interested in trying to exercise that authority. Senators led by Lindsey Graham, of all people, one of the noted top neocon hawks of the last couple decades, he, Rand Paul, believe it or not, and a few Democrats have all banded together to try and put pressure on the president to stop this deal with the Saudis, and they've drawn up quite a few resolutions basically condemning the White House's actions. Now, this is very interesting considering especially that Lindsey Graham is involved, but really most senators in general, even the non-neocon hawks like Lindsey Graham, are still quite hawkish and would tend to lean towards approving of any sort of U.S. arms sales rather than disapproving. Thankfully, for whatever reason, however, a lot of people in Washington seem to really lose patience with the Saudis after the whole Khashoggi incident. You may remember that the Washington Post had this columnist guy. He wasn't even a reporter. He was an opinion guy who lived in Turkey and was a Saudi dissident who was assassinated by the Saudis. Ever since then, I guess since he was considered a part of the Washington establishment as an employee of the Washington Post, folks in Washington really have been unhappy with the Saudis, and they're suddenly looking to stand up against them on various issues that are seemingly unrelated. For example, the Congress passed a resolution condemning the war in Yemen, a war powers resolution, and basically telling Trump that he has to get the hell out of there. And that resolution was prompted in large part by the Khashoggi killing, which again had nothing to do with the war in Yemen. I mean, the Khashoggi killing was, bad, but it was the killing of one guy. The Yemen war has killed, tens of thousands of people, probably close to 100,000 at this point. We don't really have accurate counts. However, I don't really care what their motivation is. Whatever is getting these senators to care about this very important issue, I'm happy about it. Even if it's not necessarily for the right reasons, I'm happy to have folks like Lindsey Graham on the side of truth and justice. Now, this isn't the only issue that these senators have with the president regarding the Saudi Arabians. There's also a problem with the White House apparently giving over some nuclear technology to the Saudis. A lot of Saudi Arabia's critics in Washington apparently are not too happy about learning that this barbaric monarchy could have access to nuclear weapons. And I think before the Khashoggi killing, most people would have shrugged off this sort of an act, saying, well, Iran, we got to help the Saudis. I think that the anti-Iran hysteria has been so thick in Washington that it would have been pretty reasonable for a lot of folks for the U.S. To give nuclear technology over to that country. But now people seem to be at least regarding Saudi Arabia as equally bad relative to Iran, and not somehow our good ally versus the evil Iranians. Now, of course, if you ask me, I don't like either of those countries, but Saudi Arabia is clearly much worse. I mean, you just look at them, they're far more backward than Iran is. And of course, Saudi Arabia are the folks who gave us 9/11 and all those other tragedies, because they're the ones who propagate and export the horrible and pernicious Salafist ideology. All of your Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Nusra, and Al-Shabaab types are radical Sunni Salafists who pretty much are educated in the Saudi tradition. You don't really ever hear about Iranian-influenced terrorist groups blowing up buildings in the West, or wreaking havoc, or bringing down the World Trade Center. Every time we hear about terrorist attacks and terrorist acts, it's almost always Saudi-related. The only country who really has to deal with terrorism that is in any way connected to Iran, and this is only sort of by proxy, would be Israel. Yet for some reason, the entirety of the West is supposed to regard Iran as this universal evil who's propagating terrorism, when the people who are propagating terrorism in our countries is not Iran, but Saudi Arabia. So thankfully, it seems that the Overton window with regards to criticizing American foreign policy has shifted a bit, and it is now far more acceptable to criticize our second greatest ally, Saudi Arabia. Now, this shift is by no means a panacea, but it is certainly a step in the right direction. Now, it should also be noted that there are some activists in Washington who are trying to encourage members of the House to use the National Defense Authorization Act to try and hamstring the president with regards to Yemen. The National Defense Authorization Act is something that comes up every few years because, of course, constitutionally, the U.S. cannot have a standing army. So that means that every few years, Congress must create essentially the military over from scratch and write a whole new bill. Now, it's mostly the same and just with some tweaks, but it's become a bill that always passes since the end of World War II, since it would be absolutely insane for anyone to ever advocate that, perhaps we disband the standing army and bring the troops home. Sadly, the forever war is a foregone conclusion. However, because of the necessity of passing this bill in the eyes of Congress, folks in Congress have an opportunity to try and put in some anti-Yemen language into the NDAA, essentially banning U.S. involvement in the war any further, and then putting that bill on the president's desk and essentially forcing him to sign it. Because the president is not going to veto the NDAA, because of course that would mean that there's no more military. It would all go poof and go away. And he can't very well, if Congress holds its ground, get a clean NDAA which allows him to continue spending money on Yemen, which of course he doesn't even have congressional approval anyway, but this would just be one extra step. And this would be something that the president signed. The president would essentially sign a document saying that he cannot do anything to help the Saudis in Yemen, even though he is implicitly banned from doing so. And that is, of course, because Congress makes war. The president does not make war. And Congress even explicitly passed the War Powers Resolution saying that the U.S. should not be involved in Yemen, and the president is involved there anyway. And this has led to a group of attorneys signing a letter addressed to Nancy Pelosi, essentially urging her to try and file a lawsuit against the president. And to me, this seems like it would be a pretty easy case for the Democrats to win and a pretty good PR move, because, of course, the war in Yemen is horrible. Nobody can deny that. And the president is illegally involved there. I think that the courts would definitely rule the right way on this one if it were brought up. However, as disgusting and dark as it may sound, I think that Pelosi, being the political strategist that she is waiting for a later date to bring this up, because I think she sees this as a really potent weapon against the president that she can use essentially at any time. So I think she'll want to wait till next year when we're closer to the election, so that the president is essentially getting sued for war crimes by the Democrats and is perhaps loses his case in court before the election. That would certainly look very bad for him and would hurt his chances. But of course, in order for this to happen, Pelosi is going to have to prolong U.S. involvement in this terrible war for another year. And of course, without U.S. involvement, this war would pretty much cease to exist. The war cannot go on without U.S. involvement because the Saudis are not capable of waging this sort of a campaign by themselves. The Saudi military is completely incompetent. They have no ground forces, really, to speak of, and their air force is maintained by U.S. contractors. They don't even have their own mechanics. So I think that about wraps things up for today. If you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.